Get this pauper away from the table. Emily's voice rang across the dining room, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the soft hum of conversation. Margaret froze for a moment, her hand poised over the salad fork, the silverware cold against her palm. The chandelier above reflected the crystal glasses in tiny shards of light, each glint catching her eye as if mocking the warmth that once filled this space. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and James, her son, avoided her gaze, his lips pressed into a thin line that betrayed confusion more than courage. Margaret breathed slowly, letting the words sink in without responding aloud, the quiet around the room amplifying the sting. The aroma of roasted turkey, sage, and pumpkin pie hung in the air, a reminder of the countless holidays she had orchestrated here, dinners filled with laughter and stories, now replaced by the cold precision of insult. Her mind drifted to past Sundays, afternoons when Emily had once asked for her advice on planning a family gathering, when James had sought comfort in her kitchen as a boy, small hands tugging at her apron as they baked cookies together. That same Margaret now sat at the head of the table, feeling the weight of silence pressing down, the walls seeming taller, the portraits of past generations staring in quiet judgment. She set down her glass of iced tea, the condensation leaving a small ring on the mahogany surface, and tilted her head slightly, watching the younger guests glance at each other, uneasy but unwilling to speak. Every gesture, every polite smile, felt hollow against the sharpness of Emily's command. Margaret's eyes flicked to the window, where the evening lights spilled across the lawn, the children playing outside in a carefree way that seemed foreign to the tension inside. She remembered the first time she had welcomed Emily into the family, a polite dinner with laughter that felt natural and effortless, and contrasted it with this moment, the transformation of smiles into strategic silence, of warmth into an act of control. Her breathing steadied, each inhale deliberate, anchoring herself to the present while allowing her mind to catalog the offenses, the micro-expressions, the subtle dismissals that had led to this public declaration. She recalled arranging the place cards by hand, polishing the silver, ensuring each dish arrived on time, moments of attention to detail that had once drawn quiet gratitude, now met with scorn or indifference. Margaret's hands, resting lightly on the table, betrayed nothing, yet each knuckle ached from decades of care, service, and unspoken devotion. A single thought emerged, clear and sharp. She would observe, remember, and act with precision when the time was right. The laughter from a corner of the room seemed tinny and strained, a fragile barrier against the underlying currents of tension. She noted the way Emily's eyes darted briefly toward James, a silent check, a rehearsal of control, and the brief flush of irritation that passed across his face before he looked down at his plate. Margaret's gaze moved to the food, the perfectly roasted turkey, the sides meticulously arranged, the pies cooling in their ceramic dishes, a testament to her ongoing role as provider, organizer, and silent witness. She sipped her iced tea, letting the coolness calm the prickling heat in her chest, cataloging each movement, each word, storing them carefully in her mind. The room felt simultaneously familiar and alien, a stage set with all the trappings of tradition, but stripped of genuine care. Margaret's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, quiet, unreadable, a mask of composure that concealed the storm beneath. In that instant, she resolved to let this moment pass without a word, to let the shock ripple through the room, to absorb the humiliation not with despair, but with a cold, measured clarity that would guide her next steps. Outside, the lawn shimmered under the fading sunlight, the distant sound of laughter contrasting sharply with the tense stillness inside, marking the beginning of a reckoning that no one yet anticipated, and Margaret, poised and unbroken, would be the one to define how it unfolded. Margaret pushed her chair back slightly, the scrape of wood against the hardwood floor echoing softly in the dining room as Emily continued to chatter with the younger guests, their laughter floating above the tension like wind through dry leaves. She placed her napkin neatly on her lap, her fingers lingering for a moment, noting the subtle pattern in the linen, the way the sunlight filtered through the curtains onto the polished silverware. Each reflection reminded her of years spent preparing these very meals, of the meticulous care she had taken to create warmth and tradition in this house. The faint scent of roasted vegetables and baked bread lingered in the air, mingling with the sweet aroma of apple pie cooling on the sideboard. Margaret's gaze swept across the table, observing faces that once looked to her for guidance, smiles now tinged with awkwardness, their eyes avoiding hers. James sipped his iced tea nervously, his fork hesitating over the plate before moving, a subtle tension in his shoulders that spoke of inner conflict. Margaret's mind wandered briefly to past holidays, where she had orchestrated gatherings with precision, balancing the desires of everyone, smoothing over disagreements. Yet now the room felt fractured, a fragile construct that threatened to collapse with each passing moment. She noted the placement of each chair, the alignment of the cutlery, small details that once gave her comfort, now only underscored the absence of genuine connection. The soft hum of conversation was punctuated by clinking glasses, the sound sharp against the quiet hum of her thoughts. Margaret inhaled deeply, the cool air filling her lungs, and allowed herself a moment to observe the subtle dynamics. Emily's careful monitoring of James, the way the younger cousins leaned slightly away from the tension, the polite nods that masked unease. She reflected on her own behavior, her calm, the deliberate restraint that allowed her to witness without interjecting, absorbing each nuance with clarity. Memories surfaced unbidden, James's childhood laughter echoing in this very room, Emily's tentative first steps in the family as she learned to navigate rituals and expectations. Those recollections contrasted sharply with the present, a stark reminder of how relationships had shifted. Margaret's hand brushed a fork absent-mindedly, her touch light, almost imperceptible, yet it grounded her, a tether to reality amidst the subtle currents of betrayal and discomfort. She noticed the way sunlight caught the edges of the crystal glasses, refracting into tiny rainbows that danced across the table, a moment of beauty in an otherwise tense atmosphere. Margaret allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible exhale, acknowledging the quiet storm around her while maintaining an internal equilibrium, her presence steady, calm, and deliberate. Every movement, every glance, became a careful observation, a silent ledger of the interactions, noting not only words spoken but those left unuttered. In the subdued light, the room seemed both intimate and vast, the space around her filled with unspoken thoughts and measured behaviors, the patterns of control and resistance playing out subtly in gestures and expressions. Margaret's awareness sharpened, cataloging the dynamics and tensions with quiet precision, preparing herself mentally for the moments ahead, a steady observer in a world that had shifted uncomfortably beneath her feet. Margaret's eyes drifted to the centerpieces, the candles flickering gently, casting long shadows across the table, illuminating the subtle expressions of each guest. She noticed the slight hesitation in the way her niece reached for her water glass, the careful way her nephew leaned back in his chair, the almost imperceptible glance exchanged between Emily and a distant cousin. The room seemed to pulse with tension, a delicate balance of civility and underlying unease. Margaret's hand rested lightly on the edge of her plate, fingertips tracing the rim without moving the utensils, as though anchoring herself to the solidity of the porcelain while her mind cataloged every nuance of the interactions. Memories of previous family dinners floated unbidden, the laughter of past holidays echoing faintly in the quiet of her thoughts, a sharp contrast to the strained smiles around her now. She remembered the care she had taken when setting this very table for Thanksgiving, the warmth she had fostered with each carefully prepared dish, the way she had taught James to carve the turkey with confidence while Emily observed politely from a corner. Those days felt distant, almost fragile, like glass hovering above a surface, and yet they lingered in her consciousness, sharpening her awareness of the shift in dynamics. Margaret's gaze swept over the dessert platter, noting the golden crusts of pumpkin pies, the steam still rising from warm bread, and the subtle inconsistencies in Emily's movements, the way she adjusted her chair slightly too often, the tilt of her head as she listened more than she spoke. Every small gesture became a thread in the tapestry of observation Margaret was weaving in her mind, each one contributing to a growing understanding of the strategies and tensions at play. She sipped her iced tea, allowing the cool liquid to steady her nerves, letting each swallow mark a deliberate pause that mirrored the rhythm of her thoughts. The soft murmur of polite conversation continued, punctuated by the occasional clink of glassware, the sounds sharp against the quiet intensity she felt. Margaret's focus sharpened, catching the subtleties. A forced laugh, a brief flicker of discomfort in James's eyes, the way Emily's hands remained composed but rigid, a practiced control that belied the underlying maneuvering. She allowed herself a quiet reflection, understanding that the patterns she observed were the culmination of years of interactions, small acts of assertion, and careful positioning within the family. She inhaled slowly, the scent of rosemary and thyme from the turkey mingling with the fading citrus from the centerpiece, grounding her in the present while her mind traced the currents of behavior around her. Each glance, each word, each silent pause became data, cataloged with precision, as Margaret positioned herself to respond not with haste, but with careful deliberation. Her awareness of the environment, of the subtle hierarchies, and of the unspoken rules became a quiet power, an internal compass guiding her next moves. She noted the interplay of body language, the spacing between chairs, the way light reflected off polished surfaces, and the rhythms of voices, using it all to anticipate reactions and understand intentions. Margaret's posture remained composed, a gentle weight in the chair, yet her mind moved rapidly, parsing the intricate social signals, the flickers of discomfort, and the unspoken assertions of control. She recognized that patience, observation, and restraint were her allies, that this dinner was both a test and an opportunity, and that the clarity she cultivated in silence would be the foundation for any steps she chose to take. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows, but within the room, Margaret remained vigilant, every detail noted, every movement accounted for, her calm presence a subtle but unmistakable anchor amidst the currents of tension that filled the space. Margaret leaned back slightly, the leather of the chair cool against her back as her eyes traveled across the room, capturing every fleeting expression and whispered comment. She remembered the early days of the house, when the walls had echoed with laughter and the table had been the heart of the family, a place where stories were shared, traditions upheld, and the aroma of home-cooked meals invited warmth into every corner. Now, each glance around the table reflected a different reality, subtle glances of calculation, measured gestures, polite but distant smiles, all layered with a tension that made the familiar room feel alien. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of her water glass, the condensation slipping slightly under her touch, anchoring her in the present while her mind traced the patterns of behavior, cataloging the small betrayals and moments of indifference that had accumulated over the years. She recalled evenings spent helping James with his homework, the quiet pride in watching him master a new skill, the soft encouragement offered to Emily during her first attempts at hosting, moments she had treasured, believing in the goodness of family bonds. Those memories now contrasted starkly with the subtle manipulations she observed, the way conversations were steered, the placement of hands and bodies, the pauses that carried more weight than words. Margaret allowed herself a measured sip of iced tea, the cool liquid grounding her thoughts as she noted Emily's subtle shifts, the careful monitoring of James's reactions, and the polite attention of younger relatives who seemed to sense the currents of discomfort but had not yet fully understood them. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the rim of a crystal glass and sending shards of light dancing across the tablecloth, a moment of beauty amidst the carefully orchestrated tension. She reflected quietly on her own restraint, the way she had chosen to observe rather than intervene, cataloging every action, every nuance, knowing that the patience and clarity she maintained were her tools, her quiet power. The room carried the sense of roasted turkey, fresh bread, and spiced apple cider, familiar and comforting in contrast to the unspoken undercurrents she navigated with careful attention. Margaret's posture remained poised, each movement deliberate, each breath controlled, as she silently acknowledged the strategies and unspoken hierarchies that shaped the interactions around her. She noticed how the younger guests adjusted their seating slightly, the subtle shifts in tone, the way words hung in the air with layers of intention, and she absorbed it all without outward sign, building a mental map of loyalties and tensions. Each detail, each flicker of emotion, was stored with precision, a ledger of observations that would inform her future actions. The faint sounds of the neighborhood outside, the distant laughter of children, and the soft hum of a passing car contrasted with the intense stillness within, highlighting the isolation of her awareness and the quiet intensity of her observations. Margaret remained calm, poised, and deliberate, the observer of her own story, tracing the interactions with clarity and intent, preparing herself for the eventual moment when her understanding would translate into subtle but decisive action. Margaret allowed her attention to shift slightly, noticing the subtle ways the evening continued to unfold, the polite exchanges layered with calculated intentions, each comment and gesture weighed with precision. She observed how the younger relatives maintained decorum, the careful placement of cutlery, the polite lifting of glasses, all carrying the weight of tradition, yet tinged with an unspoken tension. Her gaze lingered on the dessert table, where pies cooled and cookies rested on a decorative platter, reminders of the meals she had prepared over the years with care and anticipation of shared joy. Each aroma, each visual cue, triggered recollections of past gatherings, where laughter was abundant and the space had been filled with warmth, trust, and acknowledgement. Margaret reflected on her consistent efforts to nurture these connections, from teaching James to carve a turkey properly to guiding Emily in hosting small gatherings, moments she had treasured as small victories of inclusion and harmony. Now, however, the air carried a different weight, a subtle chill that came not from the weather but from the changes in interpersonal dynamics, from the careful avoidance of her presence and the strategic positioning of others to highlight a shift in authority. She noted Emily's slight adjustments in posture, the way she measured each word, the glances directed at James and others that hinted at silent negotiations and influence. Margaret's hands rested lightly on her lap, her posture calm, her breathing measured, yet internally she cataloged every micro-expression, every nuanced movement, forming a mental map of motivations, alliances, and potential openings. The sunlight had begun to wane, casting a softer glow through the tall windows, highlighting the textures of the tablecloth and the gleam of polished silver, small details that contrasted sharply with the undercurrents of discomfort and strategy at play. Margaret reflected on her own restraint, the quiet power in observing rather than reacting, the clarity gained from attentively witnessing the environment and human behavior without immediate response. She imagined the threads of conversation and subtle gestures interweaving to form patterns she could trace and interpret, understanding that patience and awareness were tools just as potent as words or actions. The hum of polite discussion continued, punctuated occasionally by clinking glasses, the faint laughter of younger cousins, the soft rustle of fabric as guests adjusted themselves in their chairs. Margaret's focus remained on the subtleties, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the strategic positioning of limbs, the rhythm of voices modulated to maintain social equilibrium while conveying intention. Each observation was carefully stored in her mind, a ledger of insight that would guide her when the time for deliberate action arrived. The sense of roast and baked goods mingled, familiar and comforting, yet underscored by the tension she perceived, a constant reminder of both her role and the shifting balance in the household. She breathed deeply, allowing the aroma to anchor her, while her mind remained acutely aware of all that was occurring. Each signal and nuance registered with precision, building an internal picture that would serve her in the moments ahead, ensuring she remained poised, informed, and quietly commanding in presence. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, the soft creak of leather beneath her a subtle reminder of the physical presence she maintained amidst the undercurrents of tension. Her gaze swept the room once more, tracing the careful movements of each family member, noting the slight hesitation in James's gestures, the careful modulation of Emily's tone, the tentative smiles of younger cousins that suggested both curiosity and unease. She allowed herself a slow, deliberate sip of iced tea, the coolness grounding her, a tactile anchor in a space that seemed charged with invisible currents. Memories surfaced, years of hosting gatherings, ensuring that each detail from the table settings to the timing of courses was attended with care, her efforts often invisible, assumed, yet essential to the warmth and cohesion of family events. She contrasted those memories with the present, the calculated placement of attention, the strategic glances and measured words that signaled a subtle contest of influence and authority. Margaret's attention to detail extended beyond observation to the very air in the room, the weight of conversation, the cadence of polite exchanges, the silences that carried significance. The polished silverware reflected the low light, each reflection like a small, precise recording of gestures, the positioning of hands, the alignment of bodies in the ongoing, unspoken social negotiation. She allowed her mind to catalog these interactions, storing patterns and signals that would inform her next steps, a mental map of alliances and behaviors quietly emerging as she remained composed, deliberate, and unobserved. Outside, the fading afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains, highlighting the textures of tablecloth and crystal, the warmth of the scene a stark contrast to the careful calculations unfolding inside. Margaret considered the subtle cues, noting the avoidance of eye contact, the fleeting tension in shoulders, the barely perceptible pauses in speech, each an element in the intricate choreography she now understood with clarity. Her breathing remained steady, each inhale and exhale a deliberate rhythm, the outward calm belying the quiet processing and analysis occurring within. The room was a tableau of courtesy, tradition, and subtle strategy, and Margaret's presence at its center became both a stabilizing force and an observant lens, recording, interpreting, and integrating each element into her understanding. She allowed herself a small, controlled smile, not for anyone to see, but as a personal acknowledgement of her awareness, her composure, and the patience that had become her tool. Every glance, every gesture, every softly spoken word contributed to a growing comprehension of the dynamics at play, a measured awareness that would serve as the foundation for careful, deliberate, and effective responses when the time was right. The aromas of roast turkey, herbs, and baked apples filled the air, familiar and grounding, connecting Margaret to her role and her observations, reminding her that attention, awareness, and measured calm were as vital as any spoken word or overt action in maintaining presence, influence, and insight in the unfolding scene. Margaret's mind shifted with careful deliberation, noting how the room had settled into a rhythm, the polite laughter and murmured conversations creating a thin veneer over the undercurrents she had been tracking all evening. She observed James across the table, the subtle tension in his posture, the way he adjusted his napkin repeatedly as though to occupy himself, while Emily continued to maintain an air of composed control, her movements precise, and her tone carefully modulated for effect. Margaret allowed herself a moment to catalog these nuances, committing each detail to memory, each glance and gesture a note in her internal ledger of awareness. She reflected on the numerous gatherings she had hosted over the years, the painstaking attention to decor, timing, and culinary detail that had once created spaces of warmth and cohesion, now transformed into a stage where observation, patience, and subtle calculation were required to navigate the social dynamics. The scent of roasted turkey and freshly baked bread mingled with the faint aroma of cinnamon from the pies cooling on the sideboard, grounding her in the sensory familiarity of the environment even as her mind analyzed the shifting alliances and behaviors around her. Margaret's hands rested lightly on the table, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns in the tablecloth as she considered the small, but telling gestures of each family member. The fleeting eye contact, the brief tilt of a head, the tension in a shoulder, the subtle pauses in speech. These were the indicators of strategy, influence, and control, and she cataloged them with quiet precision, understanding that her observations would inform the timing and nature of any response. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, the light catching the edges of the window panes and scattering tiny reflections onto the walls, a reminder of the passage of time and the constancy of the world beyond the confines of the dining room. Margaret's gaze returned to the faces around her, noting the mixture of curiosity, caution, and subtle competitiveness, the interplay of social maneuvering that had replaced the more overt warmth and acknowledgement of past gatherings. She sipped her iced tea slowly, the cool liquid a small comfort, a tactile anchor that reinforced her composure and focus. Each sound, each movement, Each nuance of tone became data, feeding her understanding of the dynamics and revealing opportunities. For measured action, Margaret allowed herself a small, controlled smile, not for anyone to notice, but as an affirmation of her internal clarity, her quiet command of the situation, and her ability to maintain dignity while observing, analyzing, and preparing for the moments when deliberate and thoughtful intervention would be most effective. She remained poised, her presence both calm and attentive, a steadying force in a room layered with tension, ensuring that every detail, every gesture, and every word was observed, stored, and understood for the unfolding narrative of the evening. Margaret's attention remained steady, her eyes tracing the subtle interactions around the table as the evening progressed, the polite murmur of conversation continuing with undercurrents of calculated behavior. She noticed the way Emily adjusted the placement of her napkin, the careful spacing between plates, and the deliberate pauses in speech that suggested thoughtfulness disguised as casual etiquette. James shifted slightly in his seat, his hand hovering over his fork before lowering it again, a reflection of the internal conflict Margaret had learned to read over years of observation. She allowed her mind to drift momentarily to past gatherings, recalling the laughter, shared stories, and small traditions she had meticulously cultivated. The feeling of warmth and connection that had once filled these walls now replaced by measured politeness and subtle maneuvering. Margaret's hand rested lightly on the table, fingers tracing the edge of the tablecloth, the texture grounding her as she cataloged the nuances of expression, tone, and gesture. The sunlight from the late afternoon filtered softly through the curtains, illuminating the silverware and glass in a warm glow that contrasted with the careful tension in the room. She reflected on the years of preparation, from selecting menu items to arranging seating, ensuring harmony and attention to detail, and considered how these skills of observation, patience, and subtle influence could now serve a different purpose. Each small gesture from the family members became a signal, an element in a pattern she could interpret, from a sideways glance to a brief shift in posture, each contributing to her understanding of the current dynamics. Margaret sipped her iced tea slowly, the cool liquid steadying her as she maintained her composed demeanor, allowing her mind to process the social interactions without interruption or distraction. She noted the way the younger cousins leaned slightly forward in curiosity, sensing the tension but unsure how to engage, and the brief, controlled glances exchanged between Emily and James that carried meaning beyond the words spoken. Margaret's breathing remained even, each inhale and exhale deliberate, a rhythm that anchored her attention and reinforced her internal clarity. The room carried the familiar sense of roast turkey, herbs, and baked apples, comforting and grounding, providing a sensory connection to past successes and the authority she had earned over decades of nurturing the family. Margaret cataloged each nuance, understanding that observation and awareness were her tools, patience her ally, and timing her advantage. The faint clinking of glassware punctuated the air, each sound magnified in the silence she maintained, adding to her awareness of subtle social currents and the opportunities they presented. She allowed herself a quiet acknowledgement of her own composure, the inner confidence that came from clarity and attentive observation, knowing that her continued presence, quiet yet perceptive, would inform and shape the next steps she would take in navigating the intricate dynamics of the evening. Every glance, every motion, and every unspoken word became part of a detailed internal map, preparing her to act with precision and measured intent while maintaining the outward appearance of calm, deliberate observation that had served her so well in countless similar moments before. Margaret finally rose from her chair, the subtle creak of the hardwood floor beneath her feet barely audible over the gentle hum of conversation that had resumed after the tense exchanges earlier. She moved deliberately toward the sideboard, her posture composed, each step measured and precise, allowing her presence to draw the attention of those around her without a word. Her fingers brushed lightly over the polished surface, feeling the coolness of the wood, the slight give of the tablecloth beneath her touch, a grounding connection to the familiar surroundings she had curated over decades. As she reached the dessert, she paused, her eyes scanning the room, noting the subtle reactions of Emily and James, the way their glances flickered briefly toward her, betraying a mix of surprise and unease. Margaret selected a small plate and began to serve herself with deliberate calm, the act mundane yet weighted with observation, signaling her awareness and control without disruption. She moved back to her seat, placing the plate in front of her with a quiet grace, and took a measured bite, letting the flavors of apple and cinnamon ground her in the present as her mind continued to parse the nuances of behavior around the table. The younger relatives glanced at each other nervously, sensing the shift in energy, the quiet assertion of composure that Margaret projected effortlessly. She noticed the slight hesitation in Emily's posture, the micro-expressions that betrayed her awareness of Margaret's observations, and the subtle tightening of James's jaw as he registered his mother's unwavering calm. The late afternoon sunlight had faded to a soft amber, filtering through the windows and casting gentle shadows that stretched across the room, highlighting the textures of the table, the glimmer of polished silver, and the soft lines of familiar faces now marked by tension. Margaret allowed herself a small, private smile, the kind that acknowledged her patience, clarity, and the internal balance she had cultivated over years of experience, a quiet power that required no overt declaration. She reflected on the countless times she had nurtured and guided the family, the effort that had gone into building traditions, managing gatherings, and fostering warmth, all without expectation of reward, now serving as the foundation for a measured, controlled influence that would shape the remainder of the evening. Each movement, each glance, and each unspoken word from the family members became part of a detailed mental map, cataloged with precision, revealing the alignments, tensions, and subtle hierarchies that dictated the flow of interaction. Margaret maintained her composure, a calm observer at the center of the unfolding dynamics, fully aware of the power inherent in observation and measured action. The sense of roasted turkey, baked apples, and the faint trace of herbs filled the room, grounding her in familiarity and tradition, while the soft hum of polite conversation wove a backdrop to the intricate social choreography she navigated with quiet skill. She sipped her iced tea slowly, the coolness a tactile reminder of control and presence, and allowed herself to be fully aware of each nuance, storing every detail for the precise moment when subtle action could assert clarity and influence. Margaret's awareness encompassed the entire room, the interplay of gestures, expressions, and tones, each catalogued and weighed, her internal sense of authority reinforced by the calm she projected outwardly. As the evening wore on, she remained poised, deliberate, and observant, fully engaged with the social landscape, every motion, every pause, every unspoken signal adding to her understanding and shaping the careful, quiet power she had mastered over decades of guiding and preserving the family's traditions.